What would you do if you realized that your Formula One car reacted differently at every turn, as if it were transforming with each lap? That's exactly what Lewis Hamilton is experiencing at Ferrari. But what they discovered in Hungary could change everything. Lewis Hamilton arrived at the Hungarian Grand Prix with a mixture of renewed determination and quiet emotion. It was his first season with Ferrari, a change that promised to revitalize his career. A stage with epic overtones, the 7-time world champion driving for the most legendary team in Formula One history. It wasn't just a sporting decision, it was a personal, almost romantic gamble, an attempt to close his legacy with a glorious final chapter. And if there was one venue where he seemed to have everything going for him, it was the Hungaroring. Hamilton not only dominates statistically in Hungary, but also emotionally. It is the circuit where he has achieved more victories than anywhere else, a total of 8, and where he has delivered some of the most masterful performances of his career. From impossible lines to memorable qualifying sessions, the Hungarian track was a place where his connection with the car often bordered on the supernatural. But what he experienced in 2025 was exactly the opposite. A total disconnect, almost cruel. Throughout qualifying, the camera focused on a visibly uncomfortable Hamilton, struggling with the car, talking constantly on the radio, looking for answers that never came. In the garage, his engineers analyzed every piece of data without understanding how Leclerc could be so far ahead in terms of pace. Because while Hamilton couldn't find grip, balance, or confidence, his teammate was flying around the same track with a fluidity that bordered on perfection. The contrast was not only uncomfortable, it was humiliating. And it was precisely this gulf in performance between the two Ferraris that triggered Hamilton's emotional collapse. When the Q2 flag fell, the times were indisputable. Hamilton was out by just 15 thousandths of a second. Leclerc was on pole. A ridiculous margin in terms of the stopwatch, but huge in terms of significance. Because those 15 thousandths not only knocked him out of Q3, they pushed him to his worst qualifying result in Hungary in more than a decade. Even worse, it led him to say something in public that no Ferrari driver had ever said so bluntly before. In front of the press, without filters or diplomacy, Hamilton declared, "Maybe Ferrari needs to change drivers. Today, I was absolutely useless." That statement felt like a bombshell. It wasn't rhetorical hyperbole. It was a diagnosis, an act of desperation, a confession that not only left journalists speechless, but also forced Ferrari to call an emergency meeting to understand what was going on within the team. Because this wasn't just a bad day on the track. It was a world champion publicly admitting that he felt like a hindrance to the team. It was, in essence, a complete loss of confidence in his ability to compete at the highest level with that car at that moment. The most painful thing for Ferrari was not just the fall of its star. It was the fact that it happened in Hungary, Hamilton's personal temple, where every year he seemed to defy even logic. It was there that his bond with the SF25 completely collapsed, turning the episode into a sporting tragedy. The team went from celebrating Leclerc's pole position to trying to contain an internal crisis. What should have been a day of glory became a reflection of a deep rift between driver and car. A rift that, instead of closing over time, began to reveal an even more alarming crack. The possibility that Ferrari was developing a car that only works for one of its drivers. And Hamilton, for the first time, wondered aloud if he had any place in that future. After Hamilton's tough personal defeat in qualifying in Hungary, the team's attention turned to understanding what was going on under the skin of the SF25. Ferrari knew they couldn't afford to look the other way. This wasn't a marginal difference in performance or an isolated setup error. What had happened was deeper, more disturbing, and had the potential to trigger a structural crisis. Thus began one of the most detailed technical analyses in the team's recent history. The engineers extracted the telemetry data with a clear intention: to compare every movement of Hamilton with those of Leclerc under the same conditions, on the same compounds, in similar corners. And what they found was more than worrying. The records revealed a glaring disconnect between Hamilton's inputs and the car's responses. The car seemed to be operating with an unpredictable internal logic. In some corners, it reacted aggressively to the slightest turn of the steering wheel. In others, it took vital fractions of a second to obey. It wasn't simply a difference in confidence, it was an inconsistent technical pattern. As the track temperatures rose during the sessions, that disconnect intensified. The loads passing through the rear suspension varied abnormally. The electronic brake distribution did not respond with the same precision lap after lap. And the traction control, far from stabilizing the behavior, introduced even more noise into the interaction between the tires and the engine. Most alarming was the discovery that this variability did not follow a simple logic based on degradation, temperature, or downforce. It was controlled chaos for Leclerc, but uncontrollable for Hamilton. In other words, the same car behaved like two completely different machines, depending on who was behind the wheel. Ferrari found a crucial clue in the way Hamilton applied the engine brake in low-speed corners. Under normal conditions, that style should help stabilize the rear axle. But with the new active suspension installed since the Belgian Grand Prix, that pattern generated counterproductive responses. Overload on the hydraulic system, loss of traction, and automatic micro-adjustments that only made the situation worse. The conclusion was painful but inevitable. The car was designed or developed with Leclerc's needs in mind. And this opened up a new dimension to the problem. It was no secret that Leclerc had been at Ferrari for years, building a technical relationship with the engineers and actively participating in the development of the car. His style, aggressive on entry and surgical in correction, had shaped many of the car's aerodynamic and mechanical decisions since the SF23 era. But what was once a competitive advantage was now putting one of the best drivers in modern history out of the game. Hamilton wasn't just uncomfortable. He was driving a machine that didn't understand his language. That revelation shook Ferrari's technical leadership because they could no longer blame the poor performance on adaptation, style, or even driver motivation. They were faced with a profound dilemma: how to build a competitive car for both drivers when their styles demanded completely different responses from the same chassis. And what was most worrying was what they didn't know: whether this divergence could be corrected mid-season, or whether they were destined to live with two parallel realities within the same team, with a car that was only truly competitive for one of them. Ferrari had created a powerful tool, yes, but with such a specific setup, it was like Hamilton was driving an out-of-tune instrument. And in the symphony of Formula One, that's the difference between leading an orchestra and getting lost in the noise. As the analysis became more in-depth and the answers clearer, an uncomfortable suspicion began to float through the corridors of Maranello. What if the problem wasn't just technical? What if what was happening with Hamilton wasn't simply a matter of incompatibility with the SF25, but the result of strategic decisions that, consciously or unconsciously, were favoring Charles Leclerc? Ferrari had introduced a new rear suspension at the Belgian Grand Prix. Since then, the car had shown significant improvements in traction and corner exit, greater control over height changes, and remarkable stability on technical circuits. But upon careful study of how and why that improvement worked so well in Leclerc's hands, the key emerged. The system was specifically calibrated to take full advantage of a precise, aggressive driving style based on late braking and reactive steering, exactly Leclerc's profile. In contrast, Hamilton, famous for his smooth and progressive driving, focused on tire conservation and overall car balance, found that the same suspension became his worst enemy. The dynamic height control, which offered Leclerc a stable platform to attack corners, translated into unexpected oscillations in balance, load changes mid-corner, and unpredictable rear-end reactions for Hamilton. In essence, he was fighting against a tool designed for another driver. Was this a deliberate preference, or simply a natural consequence of Leclerc's time and familiarity with the Ferrari environment? Whatever the answer, the result was the same: a technical imbalance that was turning the relationship between the two drivers and the team into a minefield. And for a driver like Hamilton, whose driving is based on that precise connection, that inability to understand and anticipate the car is not just a disadvantage, it's a competitive death sentence. After everything that happened at the Hungarian Grand Prix, what initially seemed like a simple bad weekend has turned into a storm that threatens Ferrari's stability on several levels. Because we're no longer talking about a specific performance difference between two drivers, nor is it just a poorly calibrated part or an unfavorable setup. The fracture exposed in Hungary forces Ferrari to answer a question that is as complex as it is urgent. Who is developing this car, and for whom is it being built? Ferrari needs to make a profound strategic decision. It is not a matter of modifying the rear wing or adjusting the suspension to please Hamilton. It's about redefining its technical approach so that the SF25 is not a binary car that only works for a specific driving style. It is not sustainable to rely exclusively on Leclerc's performance, however brilliant his talent. Not when you have a motorsport legend in the other seat who is still hungry for victories and whose potential is being stifled by decisions that, although unintentional, are deeply exclusionary. Hungary 2025 will be remembered not only as the circuit where Leclerc achieved a brilliant pole position, but as the day Hamilton sounded the alarm bells. With one devastating sentence, he revealed a structural imbalance that threatens to undermine Ferrari's most ambitious sporting project in the last decade. A project that until then promised glory, but now finds itself on a dangerous tightrope.